Ever looked around at the world and just, I don't know, felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of pain, suffering, evil, all of it? It's like, if God is real, if he's truly good, why is there so much bad stuff happening?
It's a question that has haunted humanity for as long as we've been around.
Totally. And honestly, it's one I've wrestled with myself. But you know what? You're definitely not alone. And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack this huge E question and hopefully gain some clarity from theologians and thinkers who've spent their lives trying to make sense of it all.
We'll offer perspectives and insights that might help navigate this difficult terrain.
Okay, so let's just address the big elephant in the room. How can a loving God exist alongside so much evil in the world? It feels like a straight-up contradiction.
And that's often the very foundation of the atheist argument against God's existence.
Right, like, if he's all-powerful, why doesn't he just stop it?
Exactly. In fact, I remember listening to this prominent atheist professor who argued that without God, the whole concept of good and evil kind of falls apart.
What do you mean, like, it doesn't exist?
Well, more like it becomes arbitrary.
Yeah.
He was saying that without God as a reference point, a kind of ultimate standard, there's no objective way to say what's truly good or evil.
Oh, I see. It's like saying, well, if there's no rule book, who's to say what's right or wrong? Everyone can just make up their own rules.
Exactly. Morality becomes relative. Maybe it's based on personal feelings or cultural norms or whatever's convenient at the moment. From a strictly atheistic viewpoint, suffering just, yes, it's a brute fact of the universe, just like gravity or the speed of light. There's no inherent moral weight to it.
Huh. That's a pretty bleak outlook, but I can see how they arrive at that conclusion. So then, how do theologians, people who do believe in a God who is both all good and all-powerful, how do they make sense of evil existing in a world he created? It seems like a paradox.
That's where things get super interesting. You see, a lot of theologians would argue that evil wasn't part of God's original creation. It wasn't like he made evil as some kind of counterpart to good.
So then where did it come from?
Many believe it's not something God created, but rather a distortion, a corruption, a twisting of God's originally good creation.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this. So it's like you have this beautiful tapestry, right? Intricately woven, perfect in every detail. And then something happens. And some of the threads get pulled, snagged, maybe even torn. The damage is there, but it doesn't negate the original beauty or the skill of the weaver.
That's a great analogy. And to really understand how that damage happened, we have to rewind all the way back to the beginning, to that whole Garden of Eden story and the introduction of free will.
Right. Adam and Eve, the forbidden fruit. It's like the ultimate bad decision story.
For those who might not be familiar, the biblical narrative describes this paradise, this garden called Eden, where God created humanity and gave them this incredible gift, the freedom to choose, to follow him or to go their own way.
And we all know how that turned out, right? Spoiler alert. They chose option B, go their own way. But how does that choice, made thousands of years ago, explain all the suffering we see today? It seems like a long time ago for things to still be so messed up.
Okay, so what if instead of picturing Eden as this small, literal garden, we expand our view? Imagine it representing the entire potential of creation, a world where God's goodness and love were meant to permeate everything.
Okay, so it's less about a physical location and more about, what, a state of being?
Exactly. It was about a way of life, a way of being in relationship with God and with each other. And when humanity chose to disobey, it wasn't just about taking a bite of some random fruit. It was about rejecting God's design for the world, this beautiful tapestry he had created.
A design where humanity was supposed to reflect God's love and basically co-create with him to make this paradise even more amazing.
Exactly. We were meant to be partners in this incredible creative process. But by choosing their own will over God's, humanity fractured that original design, introduced a glitch into the system.
It's like the world itself is still feeling the effects of that choice all these years later. It's like a wound that never fully healed.
And that is why theologians often talk about creation groaning under the weight of that choice, of that separation from God.
Wow, that is a powerful image. Okay, so let's say that's how evil entered the picture, how that tapestry got snagged. But if God is all-powerful, why not just hit the reset button? Like, why allow this brokenness, this suffering to continue? It just doesn't seem very loving.
That's where we bump up against this really complex but important concept of God's glory. And when we talk about God's glory, we're not talking about some ego trip like He needs our praise to feel good about himself.
Right. It's not like God's up there needing a cheering section or anything.
Exactly. Instead, the Bible often connects God's glory to the outpouring of his love. It's about his love being fully revealed, fully expressed in the world.
So in this view, creation itself was meant to be a reflection of that love. And we as humans were created to experience it, participate in it, reflect it outwards. It's like we were designed to be these conduits of God's love in the world.
Yes. Think of it this way. Imagine witnessing a breathtaking sunset. Does the sun need your awe to validate its existence?
Of course not.
Okay.
It's just eyes.
Yeah.
Magnificent, life-giving.
Exactly. And it doesn't become any less magnificent if you happen to miss the sunset that day. In the same way, God's love, his glory, just Ayameris, it's not dependent on us.
Okay, I'm following you. We were created to reflect God's love, not for his benefit, but for ours. But even with all that said, why allow suffering? I mean, if God is truly all-powerful, it still seems like he could just step in, fix things, make it all right.
And this is where we bump up against the mystery, the tension of free will. Think of it like this. Imagine you're a parent. Imagine you're a parent and you have this deep, unconditional love for your child. You want to protect them from every hardship, right? But you also know deep down that part of truly loving them, part of letting them become the best versions of themselves, means allowing them to make their own choices.
Oh, absolutely. It's like that saying, you can't bubble wrap your kids forever as much as you might want to sometimes.
Exactly. And as excruciating as it can be to watch them stumble and fall, to make decisions that you know might lead to pain or heartache, you understand that stepping in and fixing everything for them, well, it would actually rob them of the opportunity to learn and grow.
Right. They wouldn't develop resilience. They wouldn't discover their own strengths, their own capacity to overcome challenges. They'd be dependent instead of independent.
Exactly. And that tension, that really difficult balance between wanting to shield someone from pain and wanting to empower them to face it head on, to become who they were created to be. Well, that's at the heart of how many theologians try to reconcile the idea of a loving God with the reality of suffering in the world.
So it's not that God is indifferent to our suffering, not that he's absent or distant, but rather that he's operating within this much grander narrative, one where love and free will are kind of intertwined. And sometimes that intertwining results in both joy and pain.
You got it. It's a tough concept to grasp for sure. But thinking about it from that perspective of parental love, it does give it a new dimension, doesn't it?
It really does. But let's be real, it's still hard, like really hard, especially when you're in the middle of it, when you're the one experiencing the suffering. So where do we go from there?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And what's crucial to remember here is that this perspective, this way of understanding God's role, it doesn't pretend to offer easy answers. It doesn't dismiss the very real pain that people experience. Instead, it acknowledges the mystery of God's ways, a mystery that's powerfully illustrated in the biblical story of Job.
Oh man, Job. Talk about someone who went through the ringer. I mean, this guy lost his family, his possessions, his health, everything. It's like the ultimate worst case scenario. And yet he never cursed God. He never lost his faith.
Exactly. You know, Job's story isn't really about explaining why bad things happen. It's more of a raw and honest depiction of what it looks like to grapple with immense suffering, to wrestle with those questions of why me and why is this happening, especially when we don't have all the answers, when life feels incredibly unfair.
And what always gets me about Job is that even when his friends tried to give him explanations for his suffering, suggesting that he must have done something to deserve it, Job refused to accept that God was distant or uncaring.
It's a profound response, isn't it? Because deep down, he knew God was still there.
Right? Even in the midst of unimaginable pain.
And it's even more remarkable. God never gives Job a specific explanation for his suffering. There's no divine PowerPoint presentation breaking down all the reasons for Job's pain.
No grand reveal. No cosmic explanation. So then, where does that leave us? If there are no easy answers, if even the Bible doesn't neatly tie everything up in a bow, how are we supposed to make sense of suffering, especially when we're going through it ourselves?
That is the question, isn't it? And maybe, just maybe, the point isn't about finding all the answers. Maybe it's about something else entirely.
Okay, now you've got me really intrigued. What do you mean?
Well, the story of Job, and really the broader biblical narrative, seems to suggest that as much as we might crave a clear and concise explanation for our pain, God isn't obligated to give us one. I mean, he is God after all. But, and I think this is incredibly significant, it also suggests that even when we don't understand, he is present with us in our suffering.
So Even when we can't make sense of why something is happening, there can still be this sense, this deep down assurance that God is right there with us, in the middle of it all. Not distant, not detached, but present.
You got it. We're not alone in our pain. And that brings us back to this idea of God's glory. Remember, we were talking about how it's not about God stroking his own ego.
It's about his love, right? His love being expressed in the world.
Yes. And here's a thought-provoking idea. The Bible seems to suggest that God's glory is often most clearly seen, not in our moments of triumph or success.
Not when things are easy and comfortable.
Right, but rather in our weaknesses, our struggles, even in our suffering.
You mean like how a parent's love for their child is often most evident when that child is hurting or struggling? When they need their parent the most?
Exactly. Think about it. When do we tend to appreciate and rely on God the most? Often it's when we're going through difficult times, when we've reached the end of our own strength, and we realize our profound need for him.
It's like when you're backed into a corner and there's nowhere else to turn but up.
Yeah.
Those are the times when God's presence, his love, his comfort feels the most real.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, that's part of why God allows us to experience hardship. It's not to punish us, not because he's distant or doesn't care, but to draw us closer to himself, to reveal his love and faithfulness in ways that we could never imagine during times of ease and comfort. You know, there's that saying, the deeper the sorrow, the greater the capacity for joy.
That is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, that suffering could actually deepen our capacity for joy. It's like we need the darkness to really appreciate the light, you know? But what about when we're talking about suffering on a massive scale? Things like natural disasters, war, genocide. Where is God in those situations? It's hard to see any good coming from that kind of pain.
That's where we need to zoom out even further, to look beyond the immediate circumstances and consider the bigger picture, the grand narrative that the Bible describes. Because it's not just about the beginning, that Garden of Eden story we talked about, but it also points towards an ending.
You mean like a happy ending?
Think of it more like a glorious restoration. The book of Revelation, for instance, paints this incredible picture of a renewed creation, a new heavens and a new earth, where suffering, pain, even death itself are no more. God's presence is described as completely filling this new creation, kind of like that original vision of Eden, but on an even grander, more expansive scale.
Wow, that's quite an image. Honestly, it's hard to even wrap my mind around a world completely free from suffering. Is that even possible?
It's a radical concept, for sure. But that's the hope that's offered. And while this vision of a restored creation doesn't erase the very real pain that exists right now, it does offer a source of incredible hope, wouldn't you say?
It does. It's like this promise that darkness doesn't have the final word.
Exactly. It tells us that the story doesn't end with suffering and death. There's a day coming when, as the Bible says, God will wipe away every tear and all things will be made new.
So it's about holding those two realities in tension, the brokenness of the present and this incredible hope for the future, for ultimate restoration.
Precisely. It's about living in the already and the not yet. We already experience glimpses of God's goodness and love in the present, realize, but we also live with this confident expectation of a future where those glimpses will give way to the full, glorious, breathtaking reality of God's healing and restoration.
By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. It really helps us out. Now, back to this idea of living in the already, but not yet. It's like we're in the middle of this really long, complicated movie, but we've been given a sneak peek of the ending, and it is unbelievably good.
That's a great way to put it. And here's another crucial piece to remember. We're not just passive viewers in this grand story. If we truly believe that suffering and evil are distortions of God's good design, that they're not part of his original intent, then that means we have the incredible privilege of partnering with God in bringing about his restoration, even in the midst of a broken world.
So it's about actively participating in healing and restoration wherever we can, however we can, knowing that our actions, big or small, are part of something much bigger than ourselves.
Now you're getting it. It might look different for each of us. Maybe it's showing compassion to those who are hurting or advocating for justice and equality, or maybe it's just offering a listening ear and a kind word to someone who's struggling.
It's that reminder that even in the face of overwhelming suffering, even when it feels like darkness is winning, we can still choose to be agents of hope, reflecting God's love and bringing those glimpses of his restoration into the here and now.
And that's what's so incredible about this whole conversation, isn't it? Even though there are no easy answers to the problem of evil, wrestling with these questions, digging deep into these ancient truths, it can lead us to a deeper understanding of God's heart, a greater appreciation for the gift of free will, and ultimately a more profound experience of his love, both in the midst of suffering and in the hope of a future where it is no more.
If you ever found yourself wrestling with this question, why a good God allows evil and suffering, you're in good company. It's a question that has echoed through the centuries. And what we've discovered by exploring these different perspectives is that while there might not be a simple, easy answer, there is this deep well of wisdom we can draw from, a way of understanding God's character and purposes that can bring comfort and hope, even in the midst of pain.
It's about faith, trust, and holding on to that hope.
If this deep dive has resonated with you, if you found it helpful, be sure to check out these other videos for further exploration. And as always, thanks for diving deep with us.